She was 8 months, her ankles swollen so badly she could barely stand, and her mother-in-law was standing 3 feet away, pointing at a laundry basket that weighed more than she should have been lifting. Not asking, not suggesting, ordering. Celeste Voss didn't raise her voice. She never had to. That was the cruelest part, the way she dismantled a person, quietly, circly, with the calm authority of a woman who had never once been told no in her own home. Laurel reached for the basket, and that was the moment the front door opened. If you've ever stayed silent to protect someone you love, even while that silence was slowly breaking you, then you already understand what Laurel Voss had been carrying for months. And you'll want to stay for every word of what happened next. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because the moments coming will take your breath away. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The suitcase hit the marble floor before Graham Voss had even fully stepped through the front door. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He was tired. His flight from Frankfurt had been delayed twice, then rerouted through Toronto, and by the time the car service dropped him at the iron gate of the Voss estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut, it was barely past 9 in the morning, and he felt like he hadn't slept in 3 days, because he hadn't. The kind of exhaustion that settles into the bones, that makes even the familiar weight of your own coat feel like too much. He'd been gone for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of 14-hour days in glass conference rooms, managing the slow-motion collapse of a European acquisition that should have closed 6 months ago and kept unraveling every time he thought he had it contained. 11 weeks of phone calls at midnight, of emails that arrived before he'd finished reasoning of watching his reflection in hotel bathroom mirrors and not quite recognizing the man staring back. But he was home now, and in his right hand, he was holding a bouquet of tulips pale pink, Laurel's favorite, that he'd grabbed from a kiosk at the airport in a moment of guilt-driven optimism. They were already wilting slightly at the edges from being stuffed in the overhead bin. He'd been worried about that on the drive over. He wasn't thinking about the tulips anymore. The house was quiet in the way that large, expensive houses sometimes are, a silence that isn't peaceful, but somehow pressurized, like the air itself is holding something back. Graham set his bag down beside the entryway console and stood still for a moment, listening. The housekeeper's car wasn't in the drive. His mother's silver Mercedes was. And somewhere toward the back of the house, past the dining room and the butler's pantry and the half wall of windows that looked out over the east lawn, he could hear voices. Not arguing. That would have been easier to categorize. Just voices. One lower controlled, one softer, slightly strained. Graham followed the sounds, so you follow something you don't yet know you're afraid of. He stopped just outside the kitchen doorway. The door was half open, which meant neither woman inside could see him clearly, and he could see them both. What he saw rearranged something fundamental inside him, though he wouldn't find words for it until much later. Laurel was standing near the utility alcove, both hands wrapped around the worn handles of a large wicker laundry basket. She had it lifted an inch or two off the ground. Her face was the face of a woman in the specific kind of pain she had decided, a long time ago, not to show anyone jaw set, eyes focused on a fixed middle distance, breathing measured and deliberate. Her ankles, even from the doorway, even from this angle, were visibly swollen above her slippers. She was 32 weeks pregnant with a belly that had changed the entire geometry of how she moved through space. And she was trying to carry a laundry basket that had no business being in her hands under any circumstances. Across from her stood his mother. Celeste Voss was wearing camel-colored slacks and a cream blouse, her silver-streaked hair perfectly set, her posture the kind that comes from decades of deciding, consciously or not, that the way you hold your body is a statement about who you are and how seriously you should be taken. She was holding a china teacup, not helping, not moving toward Laurel, not even fully looking at her. Upstairs, Celeste said. Her voice was patient, the way a stone wall is patient. And when you're finished, the guest rooms still need attention. The Hartleys are coming this weekend, and I won't have those rooms looking the way they did last month. Laurel's grip on the basket tightened. I'll get to them, Laurel said. Not arguing. just confirming, in the tone of someone who has stopped expecting a different outcome. "Today," Celeste said. "Not this afternoon. This morning." And Laurel nodded. She actually nodded. That was the moment Graham stepped through the doorway. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, and without saying a single word, he took the basket from Laurel's hands. Not gently, not dramatically, just decisively, the way you remove something dangerous from someone who shouldn't be holding it. The tulips hit the floor somewhere behind him. He didn't notice. For a moment, nobody moved. Laurel looked at him the way a person looks at something they'd stopped letting themselves hope for. There was relief in her face, of course there was, but underneath it, something rawer and more complicated. Something that looked almost like shame, like she'd been caught at something, though she was the one who had been wronged. Celeste's expression shifted through several things in quick succession: surprise, recalibration, the beginning of a particular kind of composure that Graham recognized as her preparing to explain. He didn't give her the opening. He set the basket down near the doorway, turned back to Laurel, and looked at her. Really looked at her. The kind of looking he hadn't done enough of in the weeks before he left, when his attention had already been half overseas, and he'd told himself she was fine, that she was strong, that his mother had promised to take care of her, that everything would be okay until he got back. He looked at her swollen ankles, at the faint shadows under her eyes, that no amount of sleep seemed to be fully touching anymore, at the way she was standing slightly crooked, compensating for the weight she was carrying, the way she'd been compensating for a lot of things. He was beginning to understand. "How long?" he asked her quietly. Just those 2 words. Laurel opened her mouth, closed it, the smallest shake of her head. "Graham," Celeste began, "I think you're misreading." "Mom," he said it like a door closing. Not loud, just final. He picked up the tulips from the floor, handed them to Laurel, and guided her gently toward the breakfast table near the window. She sat down with the particular relief of someone who hadn't been permitted to sit down as often as she needed to. He had married Laurel 22 months ago, on a Saturday in October, in a ceremony that had been elegant without being excessive because that was Laurel's preference, and he had cared more about what she wanted than about what would impress the guests. He'd met her at a fundraiser for a childhood literacy organization. She'd been there as a volunteer, not an attendee, organizing donated books in a back hallway, while the people with money had their cocktails in the main room. He'd gotten lost looking for the bathroom and found her instead, sitting cross-legged, picture book, sorting them by reading level, with the focused attention of someone who had nowhere else they'd rather be. He asked her about the book she was holding. She'd answered without looking up. They'd talked for 40 minutes in that hallway, missing the dinner entirely, and he'd known somewhere around the 20-minute mark that he was in significant trouble in the best possible way. She was a kindergarten teacher. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Stamford with a second-hand couch and a window box of herbs she talked about with the same affection other people reserved for pets. She was funny in the dry, understated way of someone who had long ago accepted that the world was absurd and decided to find it amusing rather than exhausting. She was also more perceptive than almost anyone he'd ever spent time with. She had a way of saying the one true thing in any situation so quietly that you didn't realize she'd said it until several minutes later. His money had not impressed her. He knew this because she told him so, directly, during their third conversation. "I'm not saying it doesn't matter," she'd said. "I'm saying it's not the interesting part of you. You seem disappointed by that." He hadn't been disappointed. He'd been relieved in a way he hadn't expected to feel with anyone. His mother had been polite in the early days. The way a locked door is polite closed smoothly, no rattling, no drama. Just firmly shut. Celeste Voss had spent 30 years as the wife of a man who built things companies, a reputation, a particular kind of Greenwich dynasty that required constant maintenance and careful social architecture. When William Voss died 4 years ago, he left Celeste the estate, a substantial trust, and a position in the social ecosystem of Fairfield County that she had worked very hard to secure and had no intention of ceding. She had imagined someone for Graham. Not specifically, perhaps, but in the general category someone from one of the old families, someone whose mother she had known for decades, someone who would slot into the existing structure without requiring it to expand or shift. Laurel was a kindergarten teacher from Bridgeport who had grown up in a two-bedroom house with a mother who worked double shifts at a regional hospital. Laurel was warm and grounded and genuine in ways that Celeste had never quite learned to recognize as valuable. And Laurel was black, which Celeste would have insisted was irrelevant, and which informed every single one of her objections in ways she was either unwilling or unable to examine. She never said anything overt. Celeste Voss was not that kind of woman. She was subtler, and in some ways, that made her harder to confront. When Graham announced the engagement, Celeste had smiled and hugged Laurel and said all the correct things. At the wedding, she'd sat in the front pew in a deep teal dress and spoken to all the right people, and no one watching could have pointed to a single moment and said, "There, that's where the cruelty lives." But Laurel had felt it from the beginning. The way Celeste talked to her at family dinners through her, more accurately, as if Laurel were a somewhat transparent surface. Comments about the way the guest room had been arranged. Not criticism exactly, more like a persistent, low-level renegotiation of who had authority over the space. Questions about Laurel's work that were shaped like curiosity but landed like doubt. Kindergarten, and you find that fulfilling? I always thought I'd go quietly mad, spending the day with 5-year-olds. Laurel had handled it with a patience that impressed even herself. She was not someone who backed down from confrontation out of fear. She backed down from it out of strategy, because she understood that some battles aren't winnable through argument, and some people need time and evidence rather than debate. She had believed, for most of the first year, that Celeste would come around. When the pregnancy was confirmed in the spring, Graham's reaction had been the kind that makes a person feel seen. He'd sat very still for about 10 seconds, and then he'd covered his face with his hands, and then he'd laughed. And then they'd both cried a little, and then he'd gone to the kitchen and made terrible celebratory eggs that they'd eaten at midnight, standing at the counter in their pajamas. It was one of the best nights of her life. Celeste had received the news with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and a comment about how they'd need to think carefully about the east bedroom if they wanted to convert it into a proper nursery. The following month, Graham had been called overseas. He'd fought it. He'd genuinely tried to find another solution, a proxy, a deputy, someone else who could handle the Frankfurt situation while he stayed home. But the deal was too complex and too close to collapse, and too much of it depended on relationships that only he had built, and in the end, he'd made the calculation that he could manage it in 6 weeks and be back before anything important happened. 6 weeks had become 11. Before he left, he'd sat with his mother in the living room and asked her, directly, to take care of Laurel, to make sure she was comfortable, to not add stress to a pregnancy that her doctor had already flagged as requiring careful monitoring due to mildly elevated blood pressure. Celeste had taken his hand. "She's my daughter-in-law," Celeste had said. "I'll take care of her." What happened instead, Graham was only now beginning to understand, was something he couldn't have fully imagined. Not because he was naive about his mother's capacity for coldness, but because he'd never seen it applied to someone he loved with this kind of consistency. The requests had begun as reasonable things. Could Laurel help organize the linen closet? The housekeeper only came twice a week, and there were things that needed daily attention. Could Laurel take a look at the garden schedule, because the landscapers needed direction? Could Laurel sit in on the meeting with the caterer about the summer event Celeste was organizing for the Historical Preservation Society? Each request was explainable, justifiable, and each one in isolation, Laurel had fulfilled without complaint. But they had not existed in isolation. They had accumulated, week over week, into a structure that left Laurel with roughly the schedule and the deference of a household employee. One who was never thanked. One who was corrected when something was done imperfectly and ignored when it was done well. One who ate dinner at a kitchen table while Celeste took her meals in the dining room because she found the kitchen too warm in the evenings. When Laurel's doctor, at the 28-week appointment, had recommended additional rest and a reduction in physical activity, Celeste had not outwardly objected. She had simply, over the following week, found new ways to frame requests. Things that needed to be handled. Things Celeste herself couldn't manage due to a recurring shoulder injury that mysteriously intensified whenever physical labor was nearby. Things that surely weren't that strenuous. And Laurel needed to be careful not to become too fragile, because childbirth was a physical event, and the worst thing she could do was spend the next month on the sofa. Laurel had done the math on what standing up to this would cost her. Not just the immediate conflict, she could handle conflict, but the slow erosion of Graham's peace. The way he would be caught between two people he loved. The way Celeste would find 10 subtle ways to punish any escalation. She had watched how Celeste operated, and she understood that a direct confrontation would not resolve anything. It would simply rearrange the cruelty into a new shape. So she had survived instead. She kept a small notebook, an ordinary thing, spiral-bound, the kind she'd used to track her kindergartner's reading progress. She'd started using it to record medical appointment times and questions for her doctor. Somewhere around week 26, it had started absorbing other things. Reminders she wrote to herself late at night, when the loneliness became too specific to manage in her head alone. Don't complain. Graham has enough problems. The shoulder pain is just stress. Don't catastrophize. You're doing fine. One more week. He'll be home soon. Just get through today. She had typed 3 different messages to Graham across those 11 weeks. Long ones. Honest ones. She had described in careful and specific detail what was happening inside that house. What was being asked of her. How she felt. She had deleted every single one. Because she knew Graham. She knew exactly what he would do. He would come home. He would confront his mother. And something between them would break that might not fully heal. And she was not willing to be the reason for that. Not yet. Not over this. Not when she could still manage. Graham sat across from her at the breakfast table, while his mother stood at the kitchen counter, with her teacup and her composure. He looked at his wife's hands wrapped around the wilting tulips and thought about the man he'd been when he got on that plane 11 weeks ago. That man had believed his wife was being cared for. That man had made a calculation he now recognized as a catastrophic failure of attention. "Are you in pain right now?" he asked Laurel. Not his mother. "Laurel, my back," she admitted, small, reluctant. Like the confession cost her. "Okay," he stood. "You're going upstairs, and you're going to lie down. I'm calling Dr. Mehta. Graham, I'm fine. I'm calling Dr. Mehta," he said again, gently, absolutely without negotiation. Celeste set her teacup down on the counter with a small, precise sound. "I really do think you're reading this situation incorrectly," she said. "Laurel and I have been managing beautifully. She's been—" "Mom." He turned to look at her. "I need you to stop talking for a few minutes." Celeste's lips pressed together. He helped Laurel to her feet. She let him, which told him more than anything else she could have said, because Laurel did not easily accept help, and walked her toward the main staircase. At the foot of the stairs, she stopped and turned to look at him. "I didn't tell you," she said. "I kept trying. I wrote it out. I just couldn't." Her voice broke slightly at the edge of the last word. She steadied it. "I didn't want you to come home to a war." Graham looked at her for a long moment. "You shouldn't have had to manage this," he said. "That's not your job. That was never your job." She nodded. "Once." And then she started up the stairs, one hand trailing along the banister. Graham stood at the bottom until she reached the landing and disappeared from view. Then he turned around and walked back to the kitchen, and on the counter near the alcove, he noticed the small spiral notebook sitting beside the basket of folded dish towels. He picked it up. He recognized her handwriting immediately, the careful, looping print she used for things she wanted to remember clearly. He flipped to the first page. Medical appointments. Questions for the doctor. Iron supplements, dosage, timing. Normal things. He kept turning. The entries changed somewhere around the 9th page. Shorter. More fragmented. He sounded exhausted on the phone tonight. Didn't mention the back pain. It would just worry him. Celeste said the bathrooms looked managed, not clean. Spent an hour redoing them. Back is worse. Couldn't sleep. Wrote Graham a long message. Deleted it. He needs to focus. Baby is fine. I'm fine. Just get through today. Just today. Graham stood in the kitchen of the house he owned and read page after page of his wife's handwriting and felt something cold and clarifying move through him. Not anger yet, or not only anger. Something with more weight to it. Particular, terrible feeling of realizing you failed someone who deserved better, who said nothing, who protected you from the knowledge of their own suffering because they loved you more than they needed to be rescued. He closed the notebook. Celeste was still in the kitchen. I was taking care of her, Celeste said before he could speak. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't entirely. She needed to stay active. She needed structure. You know how she is. She would have spent the entire time on that couch. She has high blood pressure, Graham said. Her doctor told her to rest. You knew that. Light activity is... She was carrying laundry, he said. She's 32 weeks pregnant, and she was carrying laundry because you told her to. Celeste drew herself up slightly. This is my home, she said. Quietly. It's also hers, Graham said. The silence that followed had the quality of something that had needed to happen for a long time. Graham put the notebook in his jacket pocket. He had phone calls to make, a doctor to reach, a room to prepare, on the quieter side of the house, where Laurel could sleep without being woken by estate operations or morning instructions that had nothing to do with her well-being. And later, not now, but later, when Laurel was resting and the doctor had come, and Graham knew the baby was safe. He and his mother were going to have the conversation they had never quite managed to have in 22 months of careful avoidance and polite surfaces. He walked out of the kitchen. Behind him, he heard Celeste set the teacup down again. The sound of it, small, controlled, deliberate, was so characteristic of her that it almost made him tired. Almost. He was already reaching for his phone. Graham made the call to doctor. Meta from the upstairs hallway, standing outside the bedroom door with his back against the wall and his voice low enough that Laurel wouldn't hear him through the wood. The doctor picked up on the third ring, Mr. Voss. A pause, the kind that contains information before the words do. I've been meaning to reach out. Laurel missed her 31-week appointment. Graham's jaw tightened. She missed it. We called the house 3 times. We were told she was unavailable. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the baseboards. There was a scuff mark near the bottom of the door frame, small, dark, the kind that happens when someone nudges a door open with their foot because their hands are full. He stared at it. I'm going to need you to come today, he said. She's exhausted. Her ankles are swollen, and she told me her back has been bad. I don't know for how long. I can be there by 2, doctor. Meta said. Graham, how long has she been without the additional monitoring? I don't know yet, he said. That's the problem. I don't know yet. He hung up and stood in the hallway for another few seconds. Then he pushed the door open quietly. Laurel was lying on her side on top of the covers, still in her clothes, one hand resting against the curve of her belly. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open and fixed on the middle distance with the particular blankness of someone whose mind is moving very fast through very still territory. Dr. Mehta is coming at 2, he said. She didn't argue this time. Just nodded. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her feet, not close enough to crowd her, just close enough to be present. Outside, the October wind was moving through the property's old oaks, and the light through the curtains was the flat, honest light of a morning that had no interest in being pretty. You missed an appointment, he said. Her jaw shifted. I know. They called 3 times. Silence. She told them I was unavailable, Laurel said. Not a question. Yeah. A long breath out through her nose. I didn't know about the calls. She stopped. Started again. She handled the house phone. I had my cell, but the number on file at the clinic was the house line. Graham looked at his own hands. He was still wearing his watch from the flight, still set to Frankfurt time. 5 hours ahead, 6 in the evening there, and the worst day he could remember in years was still only mid-morning here. Tell me what it's been like, he said. From the beginning. Graham, not to fix it right now, he said. I just need to understand it. All of it. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not be ready. Then she started talking. She didn't cry. That was the thing that got him. She told him the entire 11 weeks in a flat, measured voice, like she was reading from a report she'd filed long ago and had stopped having feelings about. The laundry, the guest rooms, the estate manager who'd stopped taking direction from Laurel after 2 weeks because Celeste had, apparently, made clear, through some mechanism Laurel never fully identified, that his instructions came from one woman in that house and not the other. The dinners, the comments, the way Celeste would look at Laurel's plate and say nothing, just look, and somehow that was worse than if she'd said something. The shoulder that flared up whenever there was physical work within 10 feet of her. The morning Laurel had spent 45 minutes on her hands and knees cleaning behind the guest bathroom toilet because Celeste had run a finger along the base of the fixture and held it up for Laurel to see. She didn't say anything that day, Laurel said. She just showed me her finger. Graham got up from the bed. He walked to the window and stood there with his hands in his pockets. The notebook, he said. The messages you wrote and deleted. I couldn't send them. Why not? He turned around. Laurel, I needed to know, because I knew what you'd do, she said. And her voice finally had something in it now. Not anger at him, something more complicated. You'd come home. You'd fight with her. You'd fight with her. And then you'd be in the middle of something you couldn't fix, and the deal would collapse, and she would find some way to make the next 6 months unbearable in a completely different direction. And I'd rather have endured what I was already managing than introduced a whole new set of problems. That wasn't your calculation to make. It was the only calculation I had, she said. Flat. Final. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Neither of them backed down. Exactly. It was more like they arrived at a mutual recognition that this particular disagreement had no clean resolution, and both of them knew it. Okay, he said. Okay. He left her to rest and went back downstairs. Celeste was in the sitting room off the main hallway, which was where she retreated when she needed to project calm composure from a stable location. She was sitting in the wingback chair by the window with a book she wasn't reading because the book was face down on her knee and her gaze was fixed on the garden outside. Graham sat across from her. He didn't take his jacket off. He put the notebook on the coffee table between them. Celeste looked at it, didn't touch it. She missed a medical appointment, he said. Clinic called 3 times. The calls came to the house line. I may have taken messages, Celeste said. Things were very busy. Did you give her the messages? Not a question. She knew it wasn't a question. Celeste's chin lifted slightly. I may have forgotten. For 3 calls. Graham, I am not going to be interrogated in my own. You intercepted her medical calls, he said. She's 32 weeks pregnant with elevated blood pressure, and you intercepted the clinic's attempts to follow up on her care. That is an extraordinary interpretation of, is it wrong? The garden outside was doing nothing in particular. A bird moved through the frame of the window and disappeared. Celeste's hands were perfectly still in her lap, which cost her something. Graham knew his mother's hands always moved when she was genuinely disturbed. The stillness was the performance. The performance was its own confession. I was trying to help her, Celeste said. Help her do what? Develop some resilience. The word landed with a kind of confidence that told Graham she'd been holding it in reserve, had assembled the argument long ago, and believed in it. She's about to become a mother. She was coddled her entire pregnancy, worrying over every small discomfort, going soft when she needed to be building. She has high blood pressure, Graham said. Her doctor ordered rest. You knew that. Rest doesn't mean. She was cleaning bathrooms on her hands and knees. Light activity is medically endorsed. Stop, he said it quietly. The quiet was worse than volume, and they both knew it. Mom, I need you to stop. Because whatever argument you've built for this, whatever architecture you've been living inside of for the past 11 weeks that made this feel reasonable, I need you to let it go right now. Because I don't have the patience for it, and frankly, you don't deserve the audience. Celeste's mouth closed. For a moment, her face did something complicated. The composure wavered, not dramatically, just at the edges, like a frame that's slightly off square. And underneath the wavering Graham could see, briefly, something that might have been shame, or might have been the beginning of shame, which is its own different and more fragile thing. Then the composure returned. You've been gone for nearly 3 months, she said. You have no idea what it has been like to manage this household with a... She stopped herself. With a what? Graham said. Very still. Celeste looked out the window. Finish the sentence, he said. I want to hear you finish it. I was going to say, with an additional person who doesn't know how things work here. Were you? Yes. The silence stretched. Graham let it stretch because he was his mother's son in certain ways, and one of those ways was knowing that silence, applied with precision, could accomplish what argument couldn't. She's been here for almost 2 years, he said finally. She knows how things work. She's been doing them. She's been doing them while pregnant because you told her to. I asked her. You ordered her. He picked up the notebook. You want to tell me what she was doing wrong? What she didn't know? Read this and tell me what you find in here that looks like someone who doesn't know how things work. He held it out. Celeste didn't take it. I'm not going to read her private. Read it. He set it on the arm of her chair. I'm going to go check on my wife. When I come back, I want you to have read it. Because I'm done having this conversation around the thing that's actually true, and I think you know what that is. He stood up. Graham, read it, Mom. He left the room. Dr. Mehta arrived at 2:05. She was a compact, direct woman in her late 40s who had delivered approximately 1,200 babies and had 0 patients for medical situations that could have been avoided with basic care. She examined Laurel in the east bedroom, Graham's room, the largest one, where he'd moved her things that morning while Laurel slept for 2 hours, and she did it with the focused efficiency of someone assembling data before forming conclusions. Graham waited in the hallway. Celeste was elsewhere in the house. He didn't know where and wasn't tracking it. When the doctor came out, she closed the door behind her and looked at him the way doctors look at the people who weren't there when they should have been. Her blood pressure is elevated, but within a manageable range, she said. The baby's heart rate is good. Fetal position is appropriate for gestational age. But, he said, she's exhausted in a way that isn't just third trimester tired. Her body is carrying stress load that has been building for weeks. Cortisol sustained physical demand, disrupted sleep. None of this is catastrophic today, but if it had continued another 3 or 4 weeks, she stopped. She needs complete rest, no household responsibilities, no navigating difficult relationships, no stress she doesn't have to carry. That's done, Graham said. All of it. I'm going to increase her monitoring to twice weekly. I need her in the office Tuesday. She paused. The missed appointment. What happened? A communication failure, he said. That won't happen again. Dr. Mehta studied him for a moment with the clinical assessment she probably turned on everyone. Whatever she decided, she kept to herself. She's a strong woman, the doctor said. She's been managing this better than she should have had to. That's not a compliment to the situation. That's an observation about her. He said. After the doctor left, he went back in and sat beside Laurel on the bed and told her what Dr. Mehta had said. All of it. Laurel listened. She didn't say I told you so, which she could have. She didn't say I was fine, which would have been a lie they both would have had to politely ignore. She said, what happens now? You rest, he said. I handle everything else. Your mother is my problem, he said. Not yours. She was never supposed to be your problem. Laurel turned her head and looked at him with the expression she got when she was deciding whether to believe something. I mean it, he said. I know you mean it now, she said. Right now, standing here, you mean it completely. I know that, a pause. I just also know she's your mother. And that doesn't go away because you're angry. He didn't have an easy answer to that, so he didn't offer one. He found his mother in the formal dining room at 4:30. She was sitting at the long table with the notebook open in front of her, and she'd clearly been there for a while because her tea had gone cold in the cup at her elbow, and she hadn't touched it. She didn't hear him come in. She was reading, and whatever she was reading had taken her somewhere she hadn't expected to go because the composure he'd seen that morning was different now. Not gone. Celeste Voss did not go to pieces in observable ways, but altered, like something had shifted a few degrees in a direction it couldn't easily shift back from. He sat across from her. She didn't look up immediately. He waited. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were dry. She was not going to cry in front of him, and he'd known that his entire life. But there was something in her face that was more unsettling than tears would have been, because it was something he almost never saw there. Uncertainty. She wrote about you, Celeste said. Her voice was careful. I know. Celeste stopped, looked back at the notebook, turned to a specific page and read from it with the flattened affect of someone keeping themselves at a clinical distance from the content. He'll come back and things will be different. Not a man who ignores things once he sees them clearly. I just need him to see clearly. She closed the notebook. Put her hand flat on the cover. She was protecting you, Celeste said. From me. Yes. While I was making her. Yes. Celeste pressed her lips together, looked at the window. The light was going now, the October afternoon collapsing into a gray early evening, and the dining room felt very large around them. I wasn't trying to hurt her, Celeste said. Graham looked at his mother. He looked at her for a long time, and what he was looking for was whether she believed that, and what he found that she did. Which was almost the most frustrating thing of all, because it meant the cruelty hadn't been calculated. It had been casual, ambient. The natural temperature of a woman who had decided, without fully examining the decision, that Laurel's comfort was not a priority, that Laurel's limits were softness, that Laurel's presence was something to be managed rather than welcomed. I know you weren't, he said. That almost makes it worse. Celeste flinched. Small. Real. I want you to understand something, Graham said. Not as a speech, just so it's said clearly between us, so we can't revisit this conversation later and disagree about what was meant. He leaned forward slightly. Laurel is my wife. She is carrying my child. She is the person I chose and the person I will always choose. And if this house cannot be a safe place for her, if you cannot make it a safe place for her, then it stops being a place I can live. We would leave. All three of us, and I would not look back. Celeste absorbed this. You would take her over me, she said. There's no taking anyone over anyone, he said. This isn't a competition, Mom. That's the part I need you to actually hear. She has never competed with you. She has never tried to take me away from you. She's been trying, since the day she walked into this house, to make room for you. And he stopped, steadied himself. You made her carry laundry at 32 weeks pregnant because you needed her to understand who was in charge. That's not Celeste began, isn't it? The dining room held the question. Celeste's hand was still flat on the notebook cover. She pressed it harder against the table, like she was trying to feel the weight of what was inside it through the cardboard. What do you want from me, she said finally. Not aggressive. Genuinely asking, which was, Graham realized, more honesty than she'd managed all day. I want you to actually reckon with it, he said. Not explain it. Not contextualize it. Not find the framework that makes it look like you were trying to help. I want you to sit with what you did to a pregnant woman who was alone in this house and who had no one to tell. Celeste said nothing. And then, he said, I want you to decide what you're going to do about it. Because I'm not going to tell you what that looks like. That has to come from you or it doesn't mean anything. He stood up. Graham. She said his name and he stopped. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard in a long time. Something stripped of the careful management she usually applied to it. I didn't know it had gone this far. He looked at her. That's not an excuse, she added quickly. I know that's not an excuse. No, he agreed. It's not. He walked out of the dining room. In the hall, he paused, one hand on the wall. His chest was tight in the specific way it got when he was managing, more than his body wanted to process at a single time. He stood there for a moment and breathed, and then he went upstairs to sit with his wife. That night, after Laurel fell asleep, Graham went to the small study off the main landing and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about strategy, not planning, just sitting with the weight of the day, which was considerable. His phone showed 17 unread messages from Frankfurt. He turned it face down. He picked up the notebook from where he'd left it on the desk, leafed through it slowly, not for the first time, but this time without the urgent need to find the worst of it. Just reading, just understanding the full shape of what Laurel's weeks had looked like in Inside's house. He found a page he'd missed the first time, dated 6 weeks ago. Just 3 lines. Had a long conversation with myself tonight about whether I'm strong or just stubborn. Couldn't decide. Maybe there's no difference when you're this tired. Maybe when the baby comes I'll have the answer. He sat with that for a while. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed. Celeste. Probably she was a light sleeper and often moved through the house at night. He heard footsteps in the hallway below. Then the faint sound of the kitchen, water running briefly, stopping. Then silence. He thought about what his mother had said. I didn't know it had gone this far. Problem wasn't whether she'd known. The problem was that she'd built conditions where she would never have to know. Where Laurel couldn't escalate without cost, couldn't complain without being characterized, couldn't rest without being judged for softness. She'd built a closed system, and she'd done it with a kind of architectural efficiency that didn't require malicious intent, just the sustained, unconscious application of power by someone who had never seriously examined whether they had the right to use it. He put the notebook down. He'd given his mother a choice, change or leave. He hadn't said it in those exact words. He hadn't wanted to issue an ultimatum in the middle of the worst day any of them had had in years. But the choice was there, in the space between every sentence he'd spoken, and they were both smart enough to know it. He didn't know which way she'd land. He knew which way he'd respond if she chose wrong. And that certainty, hard and cold and final as anything he'd ever felt, was the truest thing he'd understood about himself in years. He was still sitting there when his phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Mehta's office, appointment confirmed for Tuesday 2:15. He typed back a confirmation and set the phone down. Then from downstairs, another sound. Not footsteps this time. A drawer. Opening. The desk in the small room off the kitchen, where Celeste kept her correspondence, her household ledgers, her personal papers, the room that was, in every practical sense, the administrative center of her domain in this house. Opening, and then closing, and then nothing. Graham didn't move. He sat in the dark study, with the notebook on the desk beside him, and listened to the silence that followed. And he understood, without being able to prove it, that something had just shifted on the floor below him. Whether it had shifted towards something better or towards something worse, he couldn't yet say. He would know by morning. Graham was still in the study when morning came. Not because he'd fallen asleep there, he hadn't slept at all. He'd sat in the dark until the dark turned gray, and then pale, and then the particular thin gold of an October morning that arrives without warmth, just light, the kind that illuminates without flattering. At some point, he'd moved to the window and stayed there, watching the east lawn emerge from the dark in slow stages, the dew on the grass catching the early light in a way that would have been beautiful on any other morning. He heard Laurel moving in the bedroom down the hall just after 7. Specific sounds of her morning, the bathroom, the slow, deliberate steps, the creak of the bed as she moved back onto it. He gave her 10 minutes, and then he went to check on her, bringing water and the prenatal vitamins from the bottle on the bathroom counter that had 3 fewer pills in it than it should have had at this point in the month, which told him something about how reliably she'd been able to maintain even the most basic routines in the past few weeks. She was sitting up in bed when he came in. She looked at him and immediately knew he hadn't slept. "You look terrible," she said. "I've been told I clean up well." Graham. "I'm fine." He handed her the water and the vitamins and sat in the chair beside the bed. "How's the back?" "Better than yesterday." She took the vitamins. "The ankles are still swollen. Dr. Mehta said to keep them elevated. There's a wedge pillow thing in the closet. I ordered it back in July, and it never made it out of the bag." Laurel looked at him steadily. "Did you sleep at all?" Thinking. "That's not sleeping. It's adjacent," he said. She didn't push it. She set the water glass on the nightstand and looked at the window for a moment, at the pale morning happening outside. Then she said, without looking at him, "What's she going to do?" "I don't know yet. Did you talk to her last night?" "No. I heard her moving around downstairs around midnight." "I didn't go down." Laurel turned back to him. Something in her expression was doing the thing it did when she was working through several considerations at once. The slight tension at the corners of her eyes, the way her mouth settled into a line that wasn't quite closed. She's going to try to explain it, Laurel said. She's going to find an angle. She always does. Maybe. Not maybe. There wasn't bitterness in it. Just fact. I've watched her do it for 2 years. She's good at it. She genuinely believes the angles she finds. That's its own problem, Graham said. I know. Laurel shifted her position, one hand moving instinctively to support the underside of her belly. I'm not asking you to choose, Graham. I need you to hear that. Whatever happens with her, I'm not asking you to. You're not asking me to choose, he said. You've never asked me for anything, which is part of how we ended up here. She went quiet at that. I don't mean that as criticism, he added. I mean it as information. About myself. About how I let this happen. Laurel looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when he said something she agreed with completely, but didn't want to make him feel worse about. Then she reached out and put her hand on his arm, briefly, and took it back. Go wash your face, she said. You look like a man who's been communing with his regrets. That's exactly what I've been doing. Go anyway. He went. Celeste was already in the kitchen when Graham came downstairs at 8:15. She was standing at the counter making tea with the focused attention of a woman who needed something to do with her hands. Her hair was set, her clothes were pressed, and she looked like she'd slept, which either meant she had or meant she was better at the performance than he was. She looked up when he came in. Sit down, she said. I'll make you something. I'm not hungry. Sit down anyway. He sat, not because she'd told him to old reflexes were not the same as current compliance, but because he was tired, and the kitchen chairs were there and standing across the room from each other felt like a staging decision. They didn't need to make this early in the morning. Celeste set a cup of coffee in front of him. Then she sat across from him with her tea. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I've been thinking, she began. I assumed. Don't, she said it firmly. Don't do that. Let me say this. He waited. She looked at her tea. Then at the window. Then, finally at him, with the directness that she deployed rarely, but that had always been, when it appeared, the thing Graham recognized as his mother's actual self, beneath the management and the performance. I've been telling myself a story, she said, for 2 years. A story about who Laurel was and what she wanted and what it meant that you chose her. And last night I read that notebook and I sat with it for a long time, and I kept trying to find the version of the story where what I was doing was reasonable, where I was protecting something legitimate. She paused. Couldn't find it. Graham said nothing. I know you're waiting for the but, she said. There isn't one. I'm not trying to contextualize it. I did things to that woman that I would not have done to someone I had decided deserved my respect, and the reason I didn't decide that has to do with, she stopped, with things about me that I don't fully understand, yet but that I intend to. It was Graham recognized the most honest thing his mother had said to him in possibly 10 years. He also recognized, with the clear-eyed exhaustion of someone who'd been awake all night processing exactly this kind of thing, that honesty in the morning after was not the same as change. That what his mother was offering was an insight, and what Laurel needed was a different woman than the one who'd been running this house for the past 11 weeks. What are you going to do about it? He said. Same words as last night. Same weight. I'd like to speak to Laurel, Celeste said. If she'll allow it. That's her decision. I'm not brokering that. I understand, and whatever you say to her, whatever you say, it cannot be the beginning of another explanation. If she hears one more version of why your intentions were good, it's going to be worse than if you'd said nothing. Celeste's hand tightened around her teacup. I know. Do you, Graham? Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it. I know. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light and tried to locate, somewhere in his chest, the straightforward anger that would have been easier to navigate than what was actually there. What was actually there was grief, the specific and exhausting grief of loving someone who has done an unforgivable thing and knowing that neither fact cancels the other out. He picked up his coffee. It was too hot. He drank it anyway. I have phone calls to make, he said. Frankfurt. The deal isn't dead yet, but it needs attention today. He paused. I need to be on calls for most of the morning. I need to know that Laurel is not going to have to manage anything in this house while I'm occupied. She won't, Celeste said. That includes being approached about anything household related, anything that requires a decision, anything that requires her to be upright and functional in a way that serves someone else's agenda. I understand. Good. He stood up, took the coffee with him, stopped at the doorway. Mom, he didn't turn around. What I said last night about leaving, I meant it. I know you did, she said quietly. That's why I couldn't sleep. He went upstairs. The Frankfurt calls consumed him from 9 until almost 1 in the afternoon. 4 hours in the small study with the door closed and his laptop open and his phone on the desk and his mind split as it had been split for 11 weeks. Between the burning building overseas and the one he'd walked back into at home. The deal was salvageable. Barely. There was a secondary buyer who'd been circling for 3 weeks, a German infrastructure fund with the capital and the appetite, but not quite the patience. And Graham spent most of the morning managing their expectations, while also managing the emotional temperature of 3 separate senior partners who had opinions about the process that were loudly and frequently expressed. At 12:40, his deputy Marcus said, "You sound different today." Different how? Like you're actually here. Last 3 weeks you were in the room, but you weren't in the room. Graham didn't respond to that immediately. Just close the gap with the infrastructure fund, he said. I'll review the amended terms tonight. He hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. Through the door he could hear the house. Nothing specific, just the ambient sounds of a large building, containing people who were being careful around each other. He'd checked on Laurel at 10:30 and found her half asleep with a book on her chest, which was the best possible thing he could have found. He'd taken the book off her chest and turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He went downstairs for lunch. Celeste was not in the kitchen. There was a covered plate on the counter sandwich, fruit. The careful gesture of someone who decided that feeding people was a language she knew how to use. He ate standing up, looking out the window at the back garden. That was when he saw it, or rather when he noticed he hadn't seen it. The notebook. He'd left it on the desk in the study last night. He was certain of it. He remembered placing it there deliberately, face up, after reading the page with the 3 lines about being strong versus stubborn. He'd set it down and moved to the window and never picked it up again. He went back to the study. The desk was clear. He checked the drawer, the side table, the shelf along the near wall where he kept reference binders, and a few books he'd never quite finished. He checked the floor in case it had slid off somehow during the night. The notebook was gone. He stood in the middle of the study and replayed the sounds he'd heard at the drawer, opening and closing, in the small room off the kitchen that was Celeste's administrative domain. He'd heard it and assigned it to restlessness, to his mother moving through her establishments in a sleepless night. He walked downstairs with a specific and rapidly assembling focus that was different from the anger of yesterday and different from the grief of this morning. This was something colder, more structural. The feeling of a man who has discovered that the perimeter he thought he'd established doesn't hold. The room off the kitchen was a small space desks, filing cabinets, bookshelves, a lamp that Celeste had always kept set to low because she claimed overhead light gave her headaches. The desk was the old roll top that had been his father's, transplanted here from the main study years ago, when Celeste had decided she needed her own administrative space separate from the household's formal office. He opened the roll top. Inside, among the neat stacked papers and the correspondence folders and the leather-bound household ledger that Celeste had maintained for 30 years, there was nothing that looked like a small spiral notebook. He went through every visible surface in the room, methodically, without rushing. Then he opened the top filing drawer and flipped through the tabs. Household accounts, service records, social calendar, insurance, and in the back of the drawer, behind the insurance folder, a manila envelope that was slightly fatter than it should have been given, that the tab on it said correspondence personal. He pulled it out, opened it. Inside was a folded piece of stationery with Celeste's handwriting on it. And beneath the stationery, the spiral notebook. He unfolded the stationery first. It was a letter, not addressed to anyone. More like the kind of letter you write to clarify your own thinking when you don't have anyone you can say these things to out loud. He read the first paragraph, then the second. Then he stopped and read the second paragraph again. The room was very still around him. He had known, on some level, that his mother's opposition to Laurel had never been purely about social class or the disruption of her expectations. He'd known it and set it aside because it was easier to manage the behavior than to confront the source. Because confronting the source meant having a conversation about things neither of them had found language for. But this letter contained the language assembled late at night by a woman who hadn't meant for anyone to see it, which meant it contained the truth. Celeste wrote about Laurel's presence in the house as an occupation. She used the word twice, not aggressively, not with conscious malice, but with the ease of someone for whom the metaphor felt accurate. An occupation of space she'd held, a renegotiation of her position that she hadn't agreed to. And woven through the domestic complaints and the observations about household management was something else, something in the texture of how Celeste wrote about Laurel when she thought no one was reading. A persistent, never quite stated thread that had to do with the fact that Laurel was black and that this house had a particular history, and that Celeste's image of its future had not contained this particular revision. She didn't write it directly. Of course she didn't. But it was there, in the specific words she chose when she described what she felt she'd lost, in the way she characterized the change Laurel represented. Not just a daughter-in-law she hadn't chosen, but a symbol of a shift she'd never consented to in a world she'd believed she understood. Graham stood in the small room off the kitchen and read his mother's private letter and understood, with the specific devastation of someone encountering a truth he had chosen not to see, exactly who his mother was and what the past 2 years had actually contained. He folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, put the notebook in his jacket pocket. He left the room, walked through the kitchen, into the hallway, and up the stairs. He knocked on the door of Celeste's sitting room. "Come in," she said. She was at her writing desk near the window, doing something with correspondence, doing something it enters, and she looked up when he entered with the expression of a woman who'd been expecting him sooner or later and had prepared something for it. He put the manila envelope on the desk in front of her. Her face went very still. "You were in my desk," she said. "You took the notebook," he said. "I was going to Why?" The word was flat as concrete. I wanted to read it again. There were things I needed to stop. He pointed at the envelope. The letter. Celeste looked at the envelope. Then she looked at him, and in that look was something he had never seen in his mother's face in 36 years. Not quite fear, not quite shame, something between them that didn't have a clean name. "That was private," she said. "Then you should have burned it," he said. "Or not written it, or written a different version that was true. You don't understand what you read. Tell me what I misunderstood." His voice was very level. He was holding himself at a controlled distance from his own reaction, because if he let go of it now, he would say things that couldn't be taken back. And he needed, first, to hear what she had to say. Specifically, walk me through what I got wrong. Celeste looked at the envelope. She stopped. "You can't read that and decide what I am." "I'm not deciding what you are," he said. "I'm telling you what I read. And I'm asking you to tell me, specifically, where I've misread it. It was written in the middle of the night when it was not a considered document. So the feelings were real, but the words were imprecise." "Yes. Then give me the precise version," he said. "Right now. Tell me what you actually feel precisely about Laurel. In this house. As my wife." Celeste said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Okay," Graham said. He took a step back from the desk. "Okay, Graham, no." He shook his head. "I've been telling myself for 2 years that this was about class and expectation and your grief about Dad and the disruption of your routine. I told myself that story because it was manageable. Because it gave you an exit, something you could work through, something that wasn't..." He stopped. "I can't tell myself that story anymore." "I love you," Celeste said. Her voice cracked on it, the first crack he'd heard. "Whatever you read in that letter, I love you, and I don't want to lose. This isn't about losing me, he said. I'm not leaving as punishment. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye socket briefly, the specific gesture of a man running low on the kind of patience that comes from hope. I'm telling you that the woman upstairs is my wife, and the child she is carrying is my daughter, and they are both going to be safe and respected in whatever home they live in. And I need you to understand what that means, not as a policy, not as a concession. I need you to actually understand what it means. He walked to the door. I'm going to call my wife's mother, he said. I'm going to ask her to come and stay. We'll move Laurel's things to the West Wing this afternoon. It's quieter there and further from. He stopped himself. It's better for her. You're separating her from the household, Celeste said. I'm protecting her from it, he said, until I know it's safe not to. He left. Diane Warren Laurel's mother arrived at the Voss estate at 4:15 that afternoon in her 12-year-old Civic, with a rolling suitcase and the particular energy of a woman who had received a phone call 3 hours ago and had started packing before she'd finished listening. She was 61, small with Laurel's eyes, and a directness that had apparently not skipped a generation. Graham met her at the door, and she looked at him with an assessment that took approximately 4 seconds. How is she? Diane said. Resting. Better than yesterday. And the baby? Strong heart rate. Doctor confirmed this morning. Diane nodded. She looked past him into the house with the expression of a woman taking in a great deal of information very quickly. And the mother-in-law? In her rooms, he said. Another nod. Whatever she'd concluded, she kept it behind her eyes. Carried her suitcase. She followed him through the house to the West Wing, with the quiet observation of someone cataloging exits. And when they reached the room where Laurel was resting, and Laurel saw her mother in the doorway, something in Laurel's face came apart in a way that Graham had not yet seen in all of this. Not the controlled management of the notebook pages, not the measured telling of the 11 weeks' history, but the specific collapse that happens when a person finally sees the one face. That means they don't have to hold it together anymore. Diane sat on the edge of the bed and put her arms around her daughter, and Graham stepped back out into the hallway and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. He stood in the corridor with his back against the wall. From inside the room, he could hear Laurel really crying. The kind that doesn't have a performance in it, the kind that comes from very deep and sounds like relief as much as grief, and he could hear Diane's voice, low and steady, the specific verbal rhythm of a woman who has held this person through hard things before and knows exactly how much pressure to apply and where. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, knees up, back against the plaster. He sat there for a long time, and from the other end of the house, from the formal east wing where Celeste's rooms occupied the corner, overlooking the garden, there was complete silence, he was beginning to understand. The sound his mother made when she was standing at the edge of something she didn't know how to cross, looking at the distance between who she had been and who she was being asked to become, with no guarantee she was capable of the journey, and no one left to tell her she didn't have to try. Graham put his head back against the wall. He had moved his pregnant wife to the far end of his own house. He had called his mother-in-law to come because he could not trust the woman who lived here to provide basic safety. He had read a letter that had rearranged the architecture of his understanding of his own family in ways that he was going to be unpacking for a very long time. And upstairs, in the small study off the landing, his phone was accumulating messages from Frankfurt about a deal that required him to be sharp and present and strategically agile, which was perhaps the most absurd demand the day had found a way to include. He heard the door to Laurel's room open. Diane stepped into the hallway and stopped when she saw him on the floor. She looked down at him for a moment. She's asleep, Diane said. Good. Diane leaned against the opposite wall. She was the kind of woman who could make standing in a hallway look settled. You want to tell me what's been happening in this house? I suspect you've already got the outline. I want your version. He told her all of it. The 11 weeks, the notebook, the missed appointments, the laundry basket, the letter he'd found that morning. He told it in the flat, sequenced way of a man who has already processed the worst of the emotion and is now operating in the territory that comes after. Not numb, exactly, but organized. functional, the part of grief that looks like competence. Diane listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. My daughter didn't tell me either, she said. I know. She was protecting everybody, Diane said. That's what she does. Always has. When she was 12 and her father left, she spent 6 months pretending to be fine so I wouldn't have to worry about her on top of everything else. A pause. She's never learned that the people who love you can handle the truth. She's learning, Graham said. Are you? He looked up at her. Are you learning? Diane said again, not unkind, just precise. Because from what you're describing, this didn't appear in a day. 2 years of this woman treating your wife like staff in her own home. What were you seeing when you were here? The question settled into him, like something heavy finding its level. I saw what I was shown, he said, and I didn't look closely enough at what was underneath. That's honest, Diane said. It's not enough, he said. No, she agreed. But it's a start, she pushed off the wall. I'm going to make some tea, she said. You should eat something. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. I had half a sandwich. That's not food. She started down the hallway, then stopped. Turned back. Graham. She waited until he looked at her. Don't blame you for this, I want you to know that. But I need you to understand what you're dealing with. Because I think you're still in the part where you believe this can be fixed with a conversation and a choice. And it can't, he said. Diane's expression was the expression of a woman who had been watching people navigate their own worst natures for 61 years and had developed specific and hard-won opinions about the rate at which that navigation actually succeeds. Some things can be fixed, she said. Some things can only be managed. The trick is knowing which one you're dealing with before you've spent everything you have, trying to fix something that only needed managing, or manage something that needed to actually be fixed. She went down the hallway. Graham stayed on the floor. Outside, the October evening was arriving faster than anyone had asked for it to, the sky through the west wing windows going from pale gold to a deep, troubled amber. The light that comes just before darkness settles in and reminds you that the day, whatever it held, is about to require an accounting. He thought about the letter in the manila envelope on Celeste's desk. He thought about Laurel's voice when she'd said, I just also know she's your mother. And that doesn't go away because you're angry. He thought about his daughter, not yet born, not yet named, currently the size of a small watermelon and possessed of, according to Dr. Meta, a strong and steady heartbeat, and what kind of house he was going to bring her home to in 8 weeks, and what he was going to do about the fact that one of the most important people in her life had just been revealed to be wasn't someone he wasn't certain he'd ever fully known. Down the hall, Laurel slept. In the east wing, his mother was silent. And in the kitchen below, Diane Warren was making tea with the calm efficiency of a woman who understood that some catastrophes can only be witnessed, not prevented, and that the most useful thing you can do in their aftermath is make sure everyone stays fed and doesn't collapse before morning. The amber light through the window went darker. Graham finally got up off the floor. He had phone calls to return, and a wife to protect, and a mother to reckon with, and a child coming in 8 weeks, whether any of them were ready or not. And the only way through any of it was forward, which was he was discovering both the most obvious and the most difficult direction any human being ever has to choose. He walked to the end of the hallway, stopped outside Laurel's door, and listened. Quiet breathing, the small specific quiet of a person finally genuinely asleep. He put his hand flat against the door for a moment, the way you touch something you're afraid of losing. Then he turned and walked toward the sound of water running in the kitchen below, toward Diane's steady presence and the ordinary mercy of someone offering to feed you when you can't quite remember how to feed yourself. And behind him, the door to his mother's wing of the house remained closed against the darkening evening, like something waiting to be opened, or something that had already decided not to be. The house ran on a different clock after Diane arrived. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing announced itself. But the temperature something inside the Voss state shifted in the specific way that happens when someone enters a closed system who was never part of the original equation summation, who doesn't know the unspoken rules, and therefore doesn't follow them. who move through the space without the careful navigation that everyone else has been performing for so long they've forgotten they're doing it. Diane made coffee at 6 in the morning without asking anyone's permission. She reorganized the West Wing bathroom to accommodate Laurel's prenatal supplies. She sat at the kitchen table with a book and a mug and didn't position herself anywhere in particular, didn't defer to anyone's established territory. Just occupied the space with the comfortable authority of a woman who understood that she was here for one reason, and that reason was sleeping in the West Wing, and everything else was noise. Celeste emerged at 7:15 and found Diane at her kitchen table. The two women had met 3 times: the wedding, the first Thanksgiving, and a brief encounter at a charity event in Stamford that neither of them had known the other would attend. They had been polite to each other in the way of people who understand that they are representatives of opposing positions in someone else's life, and that open conflict would cost the person they both claim to love. That calculation was still technically in place. But calculations look different at 7 in the morning in a kitchen when one woman's daughter has been moved to the far end of the house for her own safety. "Coffee's fresh," Diane said. She didn't look up from her book. Celeste moved to the counter and poured herself a cup with the controlled deliberateness she applied to everything. She stood with her back to the room for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she turned around. "I owe your daughter an apology," Celeste said. Diane turned a page. "You owe her more than that." Celeste's jaw tightened. "I'm aware." Diane looked up. Not hostile. Precise. Because in my experience, people who are genuinely aware of the full weight of what they've done don't usually lead with the word apology. They lead with something quieter, something that looks more like shame. Celeste set her coffee cup down on the counter with a sound that was almost controlled. "I don't think you know enough about what's happened here to make that judgment," Celeste said. "My daughter has been living in your house for almost 2 years," Diane said. "I know exactly enough." The kitchen held the silence between them like something physical. Celeste picked up her coffee and left the room. Diane turned another page. Graham found Laurel awake at 7:40, sitting up in the West Wing bed with her back against the headboard and both hands resting on her belly, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused inward attention of a woman who is listening to something only she can hear. "She's moving," Laurel said, without looking at him. He sat on the edge of the bed. Laurel took his hand and pressed it against the side of her belly, and he felt it a small, determined pressure from inside, a tiny foot or fist asserting its existence against his palm. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After a moment, Laurel said, "I've been thinking about names again." "Yeah?" "Not seriously. Just running them through. Seeing what sticks." "And?" "Nothing's sticking yet." She moved his hand slightly. "She's restless this morning. Takes after her mother." Laurel made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. He stayed for 20 minutes. When he left, Diane was coming down the hallway with a tray tea, fruit, the specific architecture of someone who has been feeding people through crisis for decades and knows that the body needs managing even when the mind can't be bothered. "I've got her," Diane said. "I know you do. Go deal with your house," she said. Not unkind, just accurate. He went. He knocked on Celeste's sitting room door at 9 o'clock. She said, "Come in." She was at the window chair again, which was where she processed things. Graham had known this since he was a child. Had known that when his mother was in the window chair, she was either at peace or at war with herself, and that the difference was only visible in her hands. This morning, her hands were in her lap, and she was not at peace. Graham sat across from her. "I need to know something," he said. "And I need you to answer it, honestly, not strategically. Not with the version that makes this manageable. The actual honest answer." Celeste looked at him. "Did you believe you were treating Laurel worse than you would have treated someone else, anyone else I might have married? Did you know, while it was happening?" Question sat in the air between them. Celeste looked at her hands. "I told myself it was about—" She stopped. Started again. "I had reasons. A list of reasons. The household, the disruption. Her not understanding how things work. Her being another stop." "Say it," Graham said. "Not for my benefit, for yours. You need to say the actual thing. Celeste's hands tightened in her lap. Her knuckles went briefly white. I told myself the list, she said finally, and I didn't look at what was underneath it. Because looking at what was underneath it was, her voice dropped. It was going to require me to be someone I didn't want to be. Someone I never thought I was. But you looked last night, he said. Yes. And she looked at him directly. Her eyes were dry. Her face was the face of a woman who has taken something apart and found inside it a component she didn't recognize and can't pretend she doesn't see. And I was that person, she said. Whatever I told myself, whatever story I built, underneath it I treated Laurel differently than I would have treated. Yes, differently. And not just because of class or background or the disruption of my plans. There was something else, something I've been. She stopped. I've been sitting with it since midnight, and I still don't have clean language for it. But it was there. Graham held her gaze for a long moment. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, uncertain about what that meant. It means I believe you, he said. It doesn't mean it's fixed. It means I know you're in the right place to start fixing it. He leaned forward. Mom, Laurel doesn't need your guilt. She's been carrying more than enough weight without adding that. What she needs, what this family needs, is you actually changing. Not trying to change, not intending to change. Actually doing it in actions, over time, without anyone giving you credit for it. Celeste absorbed this. I don't know how to. She stopped. I don't know where to begin. That's not my problem to solve, he said. You're a smart woman. Figure it out. He stood. I'm going to be on calls this morning, he said. Frankfurt needs a decision before noon. This afternoon I'm taking Laurel to the clinic for a checkup. While we're gone, I need the house to be. I need it to feel like less of a war zone when we get back. I'll speak to Diane, Celeste said. Don't manage Diane, he said. She's not interested in being managed. He left the room for the second morning in a row. The Frankfurt call at 10 o'clock went bad in the first 12 minutes. The infrastructure fund had pulled back. Not completely. They were still at the table, but their lead negotiator, a careful, methodical Dutchman named Brinkman, who communicated exclusively through implications and long silences, had introduced a set of amended terms that effectively cut the original investor's return by 11% and restructured the governance provisions in ways that would take Graham's senior partners. From annoyed to incendiary the moment they read them. Marcus was on the call. Graham could hear him breathing faster. Brinkman, Graham said, I need you to walk me through the reasoning on the governance restructure. Because from where I'm sitting, you're asking for operational control without the corresponding liability. That's not a position I can take to my partners. It is a position that reflects the current risk profile, Brinkman said. His English was excellent and unhurried, and Graham had learned over 3 months that his pauses were not hesitation but architecture. He built his sentences deliberately and meant every word. The risk profile has been managed, Graham said. We've contained the 3 primary exposure points. You've seen the updated documentation. We have reviewed it. And a pause. We feel the documentation reflects optimism, Brinkman said. We feel the ground situation may continue to evolve. Graham's hand was tight on the phone. In the study around him, the morning light was flat and useful, and he used it to focus. Define evolve. We have concerns about the regulatory environment in the next fiscal cycle. These concerns are not entirely. They are not concerns your documentation addresses. What specific regulatory concerns? Another pause. Longer. We will send them in writing, Brinkman said. By end of business today, your time. The call ended. Graham set the phone down and looked at the wall for approximately 4 seconds, which was the amount of time he permitted himself before moving to the next thing. His senior partners needed to be called before they read Brinkman's amended terms blind. He needed to call his Frankfurt attorney. He needed to review the original acquisition structure to identify where the leverage points were in a counter position. He started making calls. He was 40 minutes into the second call, deep in a conversation with his attorney about regulatory exposure and counter leverage options, when he heard something from the hallway that made him stop mid-sentence. Not loud, not dramatic. A door. Celeste's voice, low and controlled, saying something he couldn't quite parse. And then Diane's voice, Not controlled, not low, short and definitive. He told his attorney he'd call back. He was in the hallway in 15 seconds. Celeste was standing outside the West Wing corridor. Diane was in the corridor doorway, arms crossed, positioned with the specific stance of a woman who has decided that this doorway is a line and she is the line. I only wanted to speak with her, Celeste said. She saw Graham and recalibrated her posture slightly, not retreating, adjusting. She's resting, Diane said. I'm aware she's resting. I only need 5. She's resting, Diane said again. Same exact tone, same exact volume. Mom, Graham said. Celeste turned to him. What are you doing? I want to apologize to Laurel, she said. Directly. I think she deserves to hear it from me directly. Not now, Graham said. It's been 2 days. It's been 2 days, he said. And she has a doctor's appointment this afternoon, and she needs to rest before it. The apology happens when she's ready for it, not when you are. Something moved through Celeste's face. I'm trying, she said. Quiet. Strained. I know, he said. Try in a way that doesn't require something from her. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back down the main hallway toward the east wing, her footsteps deliberate and even, and Graham watched her until she turned the corner. He looked at Diane. She wake up, he asked. No, Diane said. I was already in the hallway. Thank you. Diane studied him. You've got circles under your eyes the size of dinner plates. Frankfurt. I don't care what Frankfurt needs, she said. You need 4 hours of sleep before that clinic appointment. Because you're going to be in that room with your wife and your daughter's heartbeat, and I need you to be present for it, not running on fumes and conference calls. He opened his mouth. 4 hours, she said. I've got the West Wing. You sleep? He slept. He woke at 2:15 with the specific disorientation of someone who fell asleep in daylight and woke in different daylight, the angle wrong, the quality altered. 3 hours, not 4. The Frankfurt email from Brinkman had come through at 1:45, and his phone had vibrated itself off the nightstand, and the sound of it hitting the floor had pulled him back. He read the email standing in the middle of the bedroom in his shirt from yesterday. Brinkman's written concerns were detailed, precise, and devastating. The regulatory issue wasn't speculative. There was a parliamentary review underway in the target market that had the potential to restructure the entire sector's operating framework within 18 months. It wasn't a surprise. Exactly, Graham had been aware of the review, but the timeline Brinkman's team had assembled, sourced from 3 separate contacts in the regulatory body, was accelerated beyond any projection Graham had been working from. He read it twice, set the phone down, picked it up again. The deal in its current structure was not viable. He could restructure it. There were paths. But they required concessions that his senior partners were going to resist with everything they had, and the negotiation window was closing, and he was standing in a bedroom in Greenwich instead of a conference room in Frankfurt, and his pregnant wife needed to be at the clinic in 45 minutes. He put his jacket on. He would solve Frankfurt on the other side of the appointment. He had learned something in the past 3 days about the cost of prioritizing the burning building overseas while the one at home consumed itself, and he was not going to learn it twice. Laurel was dressed and ready when he knocked on the West Wing door. She'd put on a dark blue dress that he recognized. She'd bought it specifically for the later months of pregnancy in soft fabric. Nothing that pressed anywhere it shouldn't. Her hair was back. She looked exhausted in the contained way she'd been exhausted for weeks, but something in her face was less tightly held than it had been 2 days ago. Not better. Exactly. Just less defended. Diane was behind her with a cardigan and her purse. I'm fine, Laurel said to Diane. You'll take the cardigan, Diane said. It's 60 degrees outside. The clinic will be cold. Laurel took the cardigan. They drove to the clinic in Graham's car, just the two of them Diane had offered, and Laurel had gently declined. And the gentleness of the declining told Graham that what Laurel needed in the car was not her mother's steady presence, but the specific particular privacy of being alone with her husband in a moving vehicle, where neither of them had to perform anything for anyone. They didn't talk much on the drive. He put his hand on hers on the center console, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they drove through the October afternoon, with the trees on either side of the road going amber and red The world doing its annual, indifferent, spectacular thing. The deal is in trouble, he said at a red light. How bad? Bad. Not terminal, but bad. What are you going to do? Restructure the terms. Lose some ground to save the core. It's manageable. She was quiet for a moment. When do you have to decide? Tomorrow morning? Frankfurt time. So tonight, he confirmed. She looked out the window at the passing trees. Do what you need to do. I'll be okay. Diane's there, I know. A small pause. She and Celeste had a moment this morning. In the hallway. I know. Your mother wanted to apologize to me. I know that too. He glanced at her. Are you ready for that? Laurel considered this in the way she considered things seriously, without performing the consideration. Not yet, she said. But maybe not long. The clinic was a low, clean building off the main road, the kind of medical space that tries through careful design to be calm and only partially succeeds. Dr. Mehta's office was at the end of the third hallway, and the nurse who brought them back was a young woman named Tess, who had seen Laurel at every appointment since the 8th week and who greeted her with the specific warmth of someone who had noticed the missed appointment and was relieved to see her walking through the door. The examination took 40 minutes. Graham sat in the chair beside the table and watched the monitor and listened to his daughter's heartbeat, that steady, determined percussion, the most specific sound he'd ever heard, the one that cut straight through everything and deposited him without ceremony in the part of himself that existed below, strategy and management and performance. Dr. Mehta moved the monitor carefully, pointed to the screen. She's head down, the doctor said, which is appropriate and good at this stage. Good positioning. She adjusted slightly. Growth is tracking well. Weight is on the lower end of normal, which I'd like to see improve with rest and nutrition over the next few weeks, but nothing alarming. The blood pressure? Laurel asked, still elevated. Better than Tuesday. We're going to keep monitoring it twice weekly, doctor. Mehta looked at Graham. The rest protocol I outlined, is that being maintained at home? Yes, he said. The stress factors we discussed? Addressed, he said. Dr. Mehta looked at him for a moment, the way she'd looked at him on Tuesday, with the clinical assessment she applied to everything. Good, she said. On the drive home, Laurel held the printout from the monitor, a small portrait with the shape of their daughter's profile, grainy and imprecise, and absolutely identifiable. She held it against her collarbone and looked out the window and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "She's real." "She's been real," he said. "I know. But sometimes it's the heartbeat makes it." She stopped. "She's almost here." 8 weeks, he said. 8 weeks. He turned onto the estate road. The iron gate opened automatically at the car's approach, and he drove through and up the long approach to the house, the gravel sounding under the tires in the way it always did. The familiar geography of home that had been, for the past 3 days, also the geography of a crisis. He parked. He was reaching for the door handle when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Marcus, who knew about the clinic appointment and would not be calling during it unless... 1 second, he said to Laurel. He answered. Graham. Marcus's voice had a specific quality that Graham had learned over 4 years to recognize. Not panic. Marcus didn't panic. Something tighter. Brinkman called while you were at the appointment. They've moved up the decision window. They want an answer on the restructured terms by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Frankfurt time. Graham looked at the house. That's 3 a.m. our time, he said. I know. Okay, Graham said. I'll call you in an hour. He hung up. Laurel was watching him with the expression of a woman who has learned to read her husband's phone calls. Go, she said. Laurel, go deal with it. She put her hand on his arm. I have my mother. I have the doctor's number. The baby's head down and her heartbeat is strong, and I'm going to eat something and put my feet up, and you're going to go save your deal. She squeezed his arm. Go. He walked her inside, handed her to Diane in the kitchen with the wordless transfer of a man who trusts the person he's transferring to. Diane took one look at Laurel's face and the monitor printout and started talking about dinner. Graham went upstairs. He called Marcus. He called his attorney. He called 2 of his senior partners, the ones who would take the news worst and therefore needed the most preparation time. He built the counterposition in the margins of Brinkman's email, annotating in the compressed shorthand of someone who has done this enough times to know that clarity under pressure is more valuable than comprehensiveness. He was 3 hours into it when the knock came at the study door. Not Diane knocked differently, with the brisk authority of someone who has decided to enter regardless of the answer. "Come in," he said. Celeste opened the door. She was wearing what he recognized as her private evening clothes, no jewelry, a soft gray cardigan over darker trousers, her hair slightly less set than usual. The version of his mother that existed when she wasn't managing an appearance for anyone. She was carrying a plate, sandwich, fruit, the same careful arrangement from this morning. She crossed the room and set it on the corner of the desk without comment. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, started to leave. "Mom," she stopped. "How are you doing?" "Not strategically. Just asking." Celeste turned and looked at him. Her face in the lamplight was older than it had seemed yesterday. Not in a bad way, just more accurate. Like something had been stripped back to let the actual lines show. "I'm sitting with things," she said. "What things?" "What I've done. What I'm capable of." A pause. What your father would have said. Graham was quiet. "He would have said it earlier," Celeste said. "He would have seen it earlier than you did and said it in a way I couldn't." She stopped. "He was better at that. At seeing me clearly and not letting me avoid it." "Maybe," Graham said, "not maybe." She looked at the window. "You did the right thing. Coming home. Finding the notebook. Making the calls you made." She looked back at him. "I'm not able to tell you that in a way that feels like anything other than too little too late. But I wanted you to hear me say it." Graham looked at his mother, this woman he had known his entire life, who had shaped him in ways he was still finding the edges of, who was capable of specific and sustained cruelty to someone she'd decided wasn't worth full humanity, and who was also standing in the lamplight of a study she'd used to bring him a sandwich because she didn't know what else to do. Person who had taught him how to move through the world with his spine straight and his chin up, and his word is the only currency that actually mattered. People were not simple. He knew this. He had always known this. It did not make the complicated parts easier. "Go talk to Diane," he said. "Not about Laurel. Just talk. She's a reasonable person." Celeste absorbed this. "Is she a small, genuine question?" "She raised Laurel," Graham said. "That tells you most of what you need to know." Celeste nodded. She went to the door, stopped. "She left the notebook on my desk," she said. "Laurel did. This afternoon, while you were both at the clinic. I found it when I went to my room. She put it on my desk with a piece of paper underneath it." Graham went very still. "What did it say?" he said. Celeste reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She placed a folded piece of paper on the edge of the desk. Then she left. Graham opened it. Laurel's handwriting. Careful looping print. If you want to understand something, you have to stop explaining it first. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I'm not done trying either. Neither should you be. He read it twice, set it down, sat back in his chair. Outside the study window the night had come in fully now, the kind of heavy October dark that comes when the clouds are low and the moon can't get through, and the estate grounds were a darkness interrupted only by the lights of the house itself, pooling out from the windows onto the grass below. He picked up his phone, called Marcus. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk about the counterposition." They talked for 90 minutes. By the end of it, they had the outline of something that might hold. Not perfect, not what he'd hoped for 6 months ago, but viable. A structure that protected the core and conceded the periphery and gave Brinkman enough of what he needed to close without giving him the operational leverage he'd been reaching for. "You want me to draft the response?" Marcus said. "I'll do it," Graham said. "I need to be the one to write it." "You sure? It's almost midnight here." "I'm sure." He was 2 paragraphs into the draft when he heard it. Not a sound he recognized at first. Something from the floor below, not the kitchen, not the sitting room. The West Wing. He stopped typing. Then he heard it again, and this time he recognized it, and the recognition moved through him in a cold, clean wave that wiped out every other thought in his head. Laurel, her voice. Not words. Something sharper than words. He was out of the study and down the hallway, and taking the stairs two at a time before his mind had full assembled what was happening. Moving on the pure animal instinct of a man hearing his wife in pain, the Frankfurt draft still open on his laptop, the night outside the windows, a solid wall of dark. He hit the West Wing corridor at a run. Diane was already at Laurel's door, not inside in the doorway, and the look on Diane's face was the look of a woman who is holding herself together through the specific effort of someone who cannot afford not to. Her water, Diane said. Graham, her water. He was already through the door. Laurel was sitting on the edge of the bed, both hands pressed flat against the mattress on either side of her, her face a mask of concentrated effort, and something underneath the effort that was very close to fear. She looked up at him when he came in. "It's too early," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has decided that steady is the only option. "Graham, it's too early. 8 weeks early," Diane said from the doorway. "We need to go now." He was already at Laurel's side, his hand on her back, his mind running the logistics car. "Hospital, doctor. Meta's emergency line, how far? How fast? Whether they should call ahead." "Can you stand?" he said. Yes, she stood. Her face went white for a moment and then came back. Yes. Another contraction hit before they reached the bedroom door. He felt it in the grip of her hand on his arm, sudden, total, overwhelming squeeze of it, the way her entire body went rigid, with the effort of managing something that did not ask for permission. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I've got you." "The baby's coming," Laurel said. Between her teeth, through the contraction. "She's 8 weeks early and she's coming now, and I need you to—" The contraction peaked, held, and released, and Laurel breathed through the release with the deliberate focus of someone who has been preparing for this and is now discovering that preparation and reality occupy very different territories. "I need you to not fall apart on me." "I'm not falling apart," he said. "You look like you're falling apart." "I'm fine, Graham." "I'm fine," he said. "Let's go." Celeste was in the main hallway when they came through. She had heard something, or sensed something, or simply been unable to sleep and been in the wrong place at the right moment. She took one look at Laurel and her face rearranged itself into something Graham had never seen there before. Not composure, not management, terror. The specific terror of someone who has spent months being indifferent to a person and is now standing in the hallway, watching that person move through pain and understanding, not abstractly, not theoretically, but in the body, in the gut, in the place where things are true before they're thought. Exactly what indifference costs. "I'll call ahead to the hospital," Celeste said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "Do it," Graham said. He was already moving Laurel toward the front door. "Dr. Mehta's emergency line is in the contacts on the kitchen tablet. Call her first. Tell her 32 weeks. Water broke. Contractions coming fast." "I know what to tell them," Celeste said. She had her phone out already. Diane was at Laurel's other side. They went through the front door and into the October night, the cold air hitting all of them at once, the gravel of the drive sounding under their feet, the darkness of the estate pressing in from all sides. Laurel made a sound, not a word, not a cry. The kind of sound that comes from the deepest part of a person, the sound of a body doing something enormous and unstoppable, the sound of something beginning that cannot be unbegun. Graham got her into the car. He looked at Diane over the roof. She nodded, "Get going. I'm here, she's not alone," and got into the back beside Laurel. He got behind the wheel. In the doorway of the house, illuminated by the entry lights, Celeste stood with her phone at her ear, talking to someone. Doctor. Meta's service, the hospital, he didn't know, and watching the car with an expression that contained everything she had not said, everything she had not done, and the specific, wrecking understanding of a woman who is watching the consequences of her own choices move down the driveway and into the dark, and who cannot stop it and cannot fix it, and can only stand in the light and watch and hope that there is still time. He hit the gate at the end of the drive, turned onto the road, and pushed the car into the night. Beside him, Diane's hand was on Laurel's shoulder. Laurel had her eyes closed and both hands on her belly, and her lips were moving with something she was saying to herself, or to her daughter, or to no one. Just the private language of a woman navigating the most terrifying and most fundamental thing a human body can do, 32 weeks into a pregnancy that had already survived more than it should have had to. Another contraction. Laurel's hand found Graham's arm and gripped it hard enough to leave a mark. He drove faster. Behind them, the lights of the estate diminished in the rearview mirror, and ahead of them the dark road unspooled into the distance. And somewhere in the hospital 20 minutes away, a delivery room was being prepared for a baby who had decided that she had already waited long enough. The hospital at midnight had its own particular quality of silence, not peaceful, not empty, but pressurized in the way of a place where important things are constantly happening, just out of sight, behind doors and curtains, and the professional composure of people who have learned to move quickly without appearing to run. Graham got Laurel through the emergency entrance in 11 minutes from the estate. He knew the time because he'd looked at the clock on the dashboard when they turned onto the hospital road, and he looked at the clock on the wall of the intake bay when the orderly came out with the wheelchair, and the difference between those two. Numbers was the only math his brain had been capable of performing since he'd heard Laurel's voice in the West Wing hallway. Dr. Mehta was already there. She'd been called at 11:42. And arrived before them, which told something about the kind of doctor she was that he already knew but was deeply grateful to be reminded of. She met them at the intake bay with the focused calm of someone who had triaged everything she needed to triage before walking out to meet them. "How far apart?" she asked. "Not Graham, Laurel." 4 minutes, Laurel said. Through her teeth. "Maybe 3 now." "Okay." Dr. Mehta's hand was on Laurel's wrist. Fingers at the pulse point, eyes on her watch. "We've got a room ready. NICU team is standing by as a precaution. 32 weeks is manageable, lungs are the primary concern, but we've handled earlier than this." She looked up at Laurel's face. "You with me?" "I'm with you," Laurel said. "Good," she looked at Graham. "You're coming in. Stay at her left side. Don't get between me and the monitor, and if I tell you to do something, do it without asking why." "Yes," he said. They moved. Diane stayed in the waiting area. She'd done this before, not with Laurel, but she'd done it, and she understood the geometry of a delivery room and where a mother-in-law by blood fit inside it, which was outside the door until someone came to get her. She sat in a plastic chair against the wall and put her hands in her lap and held herself very still. 20 minutes later, Celeste arrived. Graham had texted her the hospital name when they were 5 minutes out. He hadn't expected her to come, or he had, in the way you expect things you haven't fully considered. He'd sent the information and turned his attention back to the road and the woman in the seat beside him. Celeste came through the entrance with her coat pulled over the clothes she'd been wearing when they left, her hair not set, her face without its usual careful preparation, and for the first time in Graham's memory, she looked exactly her age in a way that was not diminishment but accuracy. She was 64 years old, and she had driven herself to a hospital in the middle of the night because it was 8 weeks early, and something had shifted loose in her at some point in the past 12 hours that she was still in the process of locating and naming. She came into the waiting area and saw Diane. The two women looked at each other. Celeste sat down 3 chairs away, not across the room, not beside her. 3 chairs, which was the distance of 2 people who have not resolved anything but have agreed, without speaking, that this particular waiting room at this particular hour belongs to something larger than either of their disagreements. Diane didn't say anything. After a few minutes, Celeste said, "She'll be all right." Diane looked at her. "Yes," she said, "she will. The baby will also be all right." Diane's voice was flat but not hostile, just certain. The certainty of a woman who has decided that other outcomes are not acceptable and is enforcing this decision through sheer force of conviction. Celeste nodded. They sat in their 3-chair distance, and the hospital moved around them. A nurse passing with a cart, an announcement from somewhere down the corridor. The particular fluorescent hum of a building that never fully darkens, and neither of them said anything more for a long time. Inside the delivery room, time moved differently. Graham had heard people describe labor as something that reorganizes your understanding of what the human body is capable of, and he had filed this description away as the kind of thing people say about experiences they can't fully communicate. He understood now why they couldn't communicate it. There was no language for watching the person you love most in the world move through something that enormous and that private, while you stand at their left side and do the stand at their left side and do the small, insufficient things that are the only things available to you. He held her hand. He told her she was doing well. He meant it both times he said it, and the 12 times after that. When a contraction peaked and her grip on his hand went to a pressure he hadn't known a human hand could generate, he did not make a sound about it, because whatever she was managing was so far beyond what he was managing that the comparison was not worth making. Dr. Mehta worked with a focus that was almost beautiful in its efficiency. She spoke to Laurel directly, consistently, the way you speak to someone whose attention you need to keep tethered to the room. The nurses moved around the bed with the choreography of a team that has done this together many times. At 1:17 in the morning, Laurel said, "I can't." "You can," Dr. Mehta said. "I've been—" A contraction obliterated the rest of the sentence. "When it passed, I've been doing this for 2 hours." "I know," the doctor said. "You're almost there. I need 2 more from you. Real ones." "I don't have 2 more. You have exactly 2 more, doctor," Mehta said, with the specific authority of someone who is not guessing. "I've been watching you for 7 months. You have them." Laurel looked at Graham. He looked back at her. He didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would matter. He just held her gaze, and he did not look away, and he did not flinch, and she read whatever she needed to read in his face and turned back to the doctor. "Okay," she said. She found 2 more. At 1:41 in the morning, their daughter arrived in the world at 4 pounds and 9 ounces, with a cry that was smaller than Graham had expected, and more complete than he had words, for a thin, furious announcement of existence from someone who had decided to arrive on her own schedule, regardless of what anyone else had planned. The NICU team was there in seconds, efficient and focused, and for 45 seconds, Graham couldn't see his daughter through the cluster of people around her, and those 45 seconds were the longest of his life. Then one of the NICU nurses said, good lungs." Graham put his face in his hands. He stood there like that, for a moment, hands over his face, shoulders shaking with something he couldn't have characterized precisely, that lived somewhere in the territory between relief and grief and awe and the specific, devastating love that hits you before you're ready for it. Laurel said his name. He looked up. The nurse was placing a very small, very real human being on Laurel's chest. Wrapped in a warmed blanket, a knitted hat already on her head, eyes not yet open, face scrunched with the effort of the enormous thing that had just happened to her. Laurel put both hands around her. She looked down at her daughter, and her face did something that Graham had no frame of reference for. Not happiness, though it was that, not relief, though it was that too. Something with more depth than either. Something that looked like a woman recognizing someone she already knew. "Hi," Laurel said, barely a whisper. "Hi, I know you." Graham sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them and understood something about himself that he hadn't known before, which was that every version of who he'd thought he was, prior to this moment, had been preliminary. He went to the waiting room at 2:15. Diane was on her feet before he came through the door. "She's here," he said. 4 pounds 9 ounces. Strong lungs. She'll be in the NICU for monitoring, but Dr. Mehta says if the next 48 hours go well. Diane put her hand over her mouth. He told her the rest of it and watched her absorb it with the careful, deliberate composure of a woman who had been holding herself at a controlled distance from panic for 3 hours and was now carefully, in stages, releasing the hold. "Can I see her?" Diane said. "In a little while. Laurel's asking for you." Diane went through the door. Graham stood in the empty waiting room. Celeste was still in her chair. She was looking at him with an expression that had no management in it whatsoever. Raw and tired and old, and something underneath, both of those things that he recognized, after a moment, as the specific look of a person waiting to hear something they have decided they have no right to ask for. "She's healthy," he said. "Laurel's okay." Celeste closed her eyes. Just for a moment, just long enough for something to move through her face that she couldn't have permitted to move through it if her eyes had been open. Then she opened them. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He sat down across from her, not 3 chairs away. across from her, close enough that they were having a conversation rather than occupying the same room. Her name, he said. We'd been going back and forth. Laurel wanted something that meant something, not just pretty, something with weight to it. Celeste listened. We decided on Clara, he said. Clara Diane Voss. Something happened to Celeste's face. Diane, she said. After her grandmother, he said. That was Laurel's idea. 2 months ago, before any of this. She'd already decided. The silence that followed was the kind that contains more information than most conversations. Celeste pressed her lips together. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened against each other. She named her after Diane, Celeste said again, as if repetition might help her understand the shape of it. Yes. Celeste nodded once. It was a small movement and it cost her something visible. She's a better person than I've known how to be, Celeste said. Your wife. Graham didn't argue with that. She's human, he said. She's stubborn, and she carries too much alone, and she protects people who sometimes don't deserve it. She's not a saint. She's just clear. She sees things clearly, and she acts from what she sees. Most people can't do that. I can't do that, Celeste said. You can learn, he said. Whether you do is up to you. Clara Diane Voss spent 9 days in the NICU. Graham knew the night nurses by name by the 3rd day. He knew which monitor readings were standard and which required a second look. He knew how to hold a 4-pound 9-ounce baby in a way that supported the head and didn't disturb the sensor leads, which he'd learned from a nurse named Patricia, who had approximately 40 years of experience and 0 patience for people who didn't pay attention when she showed them something. Laurel was discharged on day 3 and came back every day after that. She'd sit in the rocking chair beside the incubator for hours, reading out loud, not children's books, or not only those. She read a novel she'd been carrying around for a year. She read from a collection of essays she'd taught from the year before. She talked to Clara the way she'd talked to her throughout the pregnancy, in the specific continuing a conversation way of a woman who had always believed she was being heard. Clara gained weight. Her lungs strengthened. The monitor readings moved in the direction they needed to move. On day 5, Diane went home to Stamford. She stood in the hospital parking lot and held Laurel for a long time, and then she held Clara carefully, in the approved manner, with the sensor leads respected, and then she held Laurel again. You call me, Diane said. About anything. Nothing is too small. I know, Laurel said. And you don't wait, Diane said. You don't protect me from it. You call. Laurel looked at her mother. I'm working on that, she said. Diane cupped her daughter's face with one hand. I know you are, baby, she released her. You always were a slow learner, with asking for help. I got it from you, Diane pointed at her. That is completely inaccurate, and this is not the time. Laurel laughed. A real one, the kind that gets away from you. Diane drove away in her 12-year-old Civic, and Laurel stood in the parking lot and watched her go with the expression of a woman who has been reminded of something important about the people she comes from. Celeste came to the hospital on day 4. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. She came in the early afternoon when Graham was there and Laurel was in the rocking chair, and the room had the particular gentle concentration of 2 people watching, something small and crucial do the work of continuing to exist. She knocked on the open door. Laurel looked up. The 2 women looked at each other. Graham started to stand, and Laurel put her hand out, not stopping him, just marking that this was hers to manage, that she knew he would back whatever she decided, and she didn't need the buffer of his body in the space between them. Come in, Laurel said. Celeste came in. She stood at the edge of the room, not far, but at the distance of a person who has decided to let the other person set the terms and intends to honor that decision. She looked at Clara in the incubator. Her face did something complicated and private that she didn't try to manage. She's small, Celeste said, finally. She's gaining, Laurel said. A little over 2 ounces since Monday. Celeste nodded. She looked at Clara for a long moment. The baby was sleeping with the total commitment, sleeping of very new people, both fists closed, chest rising and falling with the slightly effortful rhythm of lungs still calibrating. I need to say something to you, Celeste said. She looked at Laurel. And I need to say it once, completely, without you saying anything until I'm finished. Can you do that? Laurel looked at her steadily. Yes. Celeste took a breath. What I did to you, the things I asked of you, the way I treated you in that house, the appointment I didn't pass on, the letter Graham found, none of it was about household management, or tradition or adjustment to change. I knew that somewhere underneath all the stories I was telling myself, and I chose the stories because the alternative was having to look directly at what I actually was and what I'd actually decided about you without ever deciding it She stopped. Her voice was controlled, but only through the kind of effort that shows. I don't have an excuse for it. I have an explanation that I've been sitting with for a week and that I intend to keep sitting with for a long time, because I think some things deserve a long time. Another stop. I am sorry. Not for how things turned out, for what I did. For the specific things, the laundry, the appointments, the room assignments, the comments, the 2 years, she stopped again. I'm sorry for all of it. Specifically, not generally. She stopped and waited. Laurel was quiet for a moment. The monitor beside Clara's incubator beeped its steady, reliable beat. I'm not going to tell you it's okay, Laurel said. Because it isn't. It was cruel. And it went on too long, and the fact that you didn't examine why you were doing it doesn't reduce the effect of what you did. I know, Celeste said, and I'm not going to tell you I forgive you, because I'm not there yet. Laurel's voice was even, not hard, just honest, in the way she'd always been honest, without performance, without hedging. What I will tell you is that I haven't decided you're a lost cause. And that's not a small thing for me right now. Celeste absorbed this. It's not, she agreed quietly. There's a child in that incubator, Laurel said. She came into a difficult situation that she had no part in making, and she's working her way through it with everything she has. That's what I'm focused on. Getting her home. Getting her strong. She paused. What you do from here, that's your work. I can't do it for you, and I'm not going to try. I'm not asking you to, Celeste said. Good. Another silence. Not hostile. Something more like the silence of two people who have arrived at an honest and are staying in it long enough to know it's real. Celeste stopped. Started again. Is it permitted to? You can look at her, Laurel said. Come look at her. Celeste crossed the room. She stood beside the incubator and looked down at Clara Diane Voss, who was sleeping through the most significant moment her grandmother had experienced in years, which was exactly the kind of thing babies do. Celeste's hand came up slowly. She didn't touch the incubator. She held her hand in the air near the clear plastic side, at the distance of someone who hasn't yet been given permission to get closer and isn't going to take it without being offered. Clara Diane, Celeste said softly. A statement, not a question. Hearing the name in the room. Yes, Laurel said. Celeste looked at Laurel over the incubator. Whatever she saw in Laurel's face, she received without trying to match it or manage it. Thank you, she said, for that. Don't thank me, Laurel said. Earn it. Clara came home on a Tuesday in November. The estate had been prepared, not by Celeste alone, and not by hired staff. Graham had spent the weekend before Clara's discharge in the nursery, doing the practical physical work of making it right, and Celeste had come in on Saturday afternoon without asking and without announcement and worked beside him for 4 hours. They didn't talk much. They built the crib. They assembled the monitor stand. Graham held things, and Celeste directed with the organizational precision she applied to everything. And somewhere around hour 3, Graham noticed that she'd stopped telling him how his father had built things and started just handing him the pieces she needed him to hold, which was its own kind of change. The drive home from the hospital was quiet. Clara was in the infant seat in the back, strapped with the careful correctness of 2 people who had watched the nurse demonstrate the buckle configuration twice, to be sure. Laurel sat beside her. Graham drove. He kept looking in the rearview mirror, not checking the road behind him, looking at his daughter's face, which was doing nothing in particular. The face of a person for whom the world is entirely new and consistently overwhelming and deeply absorbing. Laurel caught him looking. Eyes forward, she said. I'm driving fine, eyes forward anyway. He drove. He put his eyes forward. He was smiling in the specific uncontrolled way of someone whose face has decided something without consulting the rest of them. Celeste was on the front step when they pulled up. She didn't rush to the car, she waited. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and she was wearing a camel coat, and she stood on that step with the posture she'd had for 64 years. Straight, composed, carrying the weight of herself without making it visible. But there was something in her face that wasn't composed at all. Graham got the carrier out of the back. He looked at his mother on the step. She came down. He let her come to him, rather than going to her, which he'd decided without deciding it, and she came down the 3 steps from the entrance and stopped in front of him and looked at Clara in the carrier. Clara was awake and looking at nothing in particular with the unfocused attention of someone who is sensing light and shape, but not yet meaning. "Hello, Clara," Celeste said quietly, to the baby. Not to anyone else in the driveway, just to the small person in the carrier, who was not yet capable of understanding or judgment, and therefore was, in some ways, the safest audience Celeste had ever had. Clara's eyes moved vaguely in the direction of the voice. Graham looked at his mother's face and saw something there he had not seen in a long time. Not the grief of the first year after his father died, and not the controlled version she wore like a second coat, but something older and more uncertain. The face of a woman who is standing at the beginning of something she doesn't know how to do and has decided to do it anyway. They went inside. The months that followed were not a transformation. They were a practice. Celeste took over the household management in a way that was genuinely useful, rather than controlling the distinction, being that she stopped requiring anyone else to execute her standards, and started maintaining them herself. She hired a housekeeper to come 4 days a week, and she worked alongside her, rather than directing from a distance. She was in the kitchen in the mornings before Laurel was up, and she was out of the kitchen before Laurel came down, and the coffee was always made, and the counter was always clear, and none of it came with a performance attached. She didn't touch Clara without being invited. She learned this about herself, that she had a tendency to reach, and that reaching was a form of taking, however gentle, and that some things required waiting to be offered. When Laurel held Clara out to her, she took her with both arms, and the careful attention of someone who understands they are holding something they have not yet earned the right to be casual with. Graham restructured the Frankfurt deal in the first week of November. It closed in December, smaller than he'd planned and functional, which he recognized as the deal reflecting the year he'd had imperfect outcomes reached through hard work and concession. He hired a deputy who had actual authority rather than nominal authority, which required him to practice the same thing his mother was practicing, which was the relinquishing of control in service of something that worked better than control could manage alone. He was home for dinner 4 nights out of 5. Laurel went back to her classroom in February. She hadn't been sure she would, not because she didn't love it, but because she'd been away long enough that the classroom existed now in her memory as something bright and slightly distant, and there was a specific fear. She told Graham one night that she'd walk back in and find it had stopped being hers. She walked back in on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of February into a room of 22 5-year-olds who had been informed by their substitute that their real teacher was coming back today. And the noise they made when she came through the door was not something she had prepared herself for. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of them looking at her and felt the specific clarifying joy of being exactly where you belong. She called Graham at lunch. "It's still mine," she said. "I know," he said. "You knew that." "I knew that," he said. "You needed to walk in and check." She went back every day after that. One afternoon in October, Clara, 11 months old, and navigating the world on her stomach with the focused determination of someone who has places to be Laurel, was in the small sitting room off the main hallway when she found the notebook. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for a pen in the drawer of the end table and found instead the small spiral-bound thing she hadn't thought about in months, tucked beneath an old magazine and a pair of reading glasses that didn't belong to anyone currently in the house. She sat down with it. She turned the pages slowly, reading herself from the inside of those months, the appointments, the dosages, the notes that had become something else. The pages that were the truest record she had of what it had cost to stay silent, and what that silence had preserved, and what it had failed to preserve, and whether the math had ever made sense. She turned to the last page. The sentence she'd written on the worst night. I hope someday his mother will love this baby. Even if she never learns to love me, was there, in her own handwriting, exactly as she'd left it. Beneath it, in handwriting she recognized, but had not expected to find there, was another line. Celeste's careful cursive. Written at some point in the months since. She couldn't have said when, didn't know what night or what state of mind, only that it had been done privately and left without announcement, the way the most genuine things tend to be done. You never had to earn your place in this family. I was the one who had to learn how to make room for you. Laurel read it twice. She sat with it. She wasn't going to pretend it fixed anything. She wasn't built for that kind of erasure, and she had no interest in performing it. The months in that house were real. The laundry was real. The appointments were real. The letter in the desk was real. And the 2 years of careful, ambient cruelty were real. And none of that disappeared because someone had found language for their culpability after the fact. But this was also real. The sentence on the page. The fact that it had been written in private. The fact that it named the thing precisely. Not I'm sorry I was difficult, or I hope we can move forward, the actual true. But the actual true thing, the room had needed to be made, and she had been the one who needed to make it. That was not nothing. Laurel closed the notebook. She stood and walked to the large window that looked out over the back garden, and through the glass she could see Graham in the grass with Clara on a blanket between them. And Clara was in the middle of explaining something with the full commitment of her body, both arms, moving, one leg kicking, voice producing sounds that meant something enormous, even without words, to shape them. Graham was listening with the complete attention of a man who has learned, at some cost, what it means to actually be present for the person in front of him. And Celeste was there. She was sitting in the garden chair a few feet away, and she was making a face, an absurd, ridiculous, undignified face, the kind Celeste Voss would not have made in front of anyone 18 months ago, the kind that requires you to have decided that being seen matters more than being composed, and Clarissa saw it, and her whole body seized with laughter. The helpless, full-body laughter of almost 1-year-olds that requires both hands to contain and still doesn't fit. Laurel watched through the window. She watched her daughter laugh, and her husband laugh, and her mother-in-law make another face and laugh too, and she stood in the sitting room, holding the closed notebook against her chest, and felt the specific, uncomplicated, hard-won weight of a life that had not resolved itself cleanly, but had resolved itself honestly, which was the only resolution she had ever believed in. She went outside. The October air was cold and clear, and the grass was still wet from the morning. And when she came around the corner of the house into the back garden, Graham looked up and smiled at her, in the way he'd smiled at her, in that hospital hallway, 3 years ago, when she was reading picture books on the floor and wasn't yet looking at him, the smile of a man who has found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Clara saw her. Clara's whole face reorganized itself around the sight of her mother coming across the grass, and she made the sound that was her name for Laurel, not the word yet, but the specific sound that meant only one thing, that she'd been making for 2 months, that would become a word in another few weeks and would mean the same thing it meant now. Laurel sat on the blanket. She gathered her daughter into her lap and felt the weight of her there, the specific, substantial, warm weight of a child who had fought her way into the world 8 weeks early at 4 pounds 9 ounces and was now 11 pounds of focused, curious, laughing, grabbing, fully arrived human person. Celeste reached out and straightened the collar of Clara's jacket. It was a small gesture, domestic, the kind that doesn't require acknowledgement. Laurel looked at her. Celeste met her eyes. Neither of them said anything. Laurel shifted Clara in her lap, and after a moment, without ceremony, she reached out and put her hand over Celeste's where it rested on the arm of the garden chair. Not a declaration, not a conclusion, just a hand placed over another hand in the specific October light of a garden, where the trees were going amber and red, and the ground was cold beneath the blanket, and a baby was laughing at nothing in particular, and 2 women who had come to each other through damage were sitting in the same space, choosing, without performing the choice, to remain. Graham saw it. He didn't say anything. He looked at his wife's face, and at his mother's face, and at his daughter's face, and he understood. in the clear and sober way of a man who has paid a high price for a specific lesson that the home you build is not the one you start with. It's the one you earn through the willingness to stay in the room when leaving would be easier, to say the true thing when the comfortable thing is available, to make space you are not required to make, and keep making it even when no one is watching. The estate had not become a perfect place. It had become a true one. And Laurel Voss sat in the October garden of the house that had once made her a stranger, holding her daughter in her lap and her mother-in-law's hand in hers, and she did not need anyone's permission to know exactly what she was, where she belonged, and what she had built out of the hardest year of her life. She already knew. She had known it from the beginning. She had simply survived long enough for everyone else to catch up.